Well, happy Memorial Day weekend. Man, I turned on the church AC. It's officially summer, right? No, it's a great weekend to be together. And this weekend, we're actually finishing up a series that we've been talking about called He Goes Before You. This is the final message in this series. This series was launched out of Easter. And during Easter, we were finishing up the Gospel of Mark, and we heard at the very end of the Gospel of Mark that there's an angel at the tomb, and we see this message that Jesus has for his disciples, that the angel gives, and the angel says, Jesus has risen, right? He's risen from the dead, and he's going out before you. He will meet with you, just like he said in Galilee. Jesus is going out ahead of you out into this world. And from that Easter message, what we did is we've been surveying through now the book of Acts. And we're looking together at the various ways and the various places in which people encounter Jesus in their lives. How is it that people encounter this resurrected Jesus that goes before us? He's out in this world. And basically, we're building this spectrum of various different ways that we encounter Jesus in the various different places and scenarios that we often encounter Jesus. So far in the book of Acts, through these past few weeks in this message, we've seen Jesus appear in physical appearances, resurrection appearances. We've seen people have visions of Jesus, but we've also seen more subtle ways where Jesus appears in a divinely ordained conversation. Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, for example. And there are many more through this series that we've seen. But in this morning's passage, we will see the people surrounding Paul encounter Jesus almost secondhand. Almost secondhand. In fact, it's hard to really describe what's going on in this passage. And maybe this has happened to you before, and you're familiar with this, right? Where someone close to you has some sort of encounter with Jesus. They have an encounter with God. Something happens, right? And then they directly impact, from that encounter that they had, right? Your life is directly impacted by their Jesus encounter. And it sort of feels like a second-hand Jesus encounter that you're experiencing through what's happening in that other person's life. So for example, an example of what I mean by this, it's a long-ish story, but I had a Jesus encounter of my own, right? When I was called out of a career in engineering and into the ministry to become a pastor. And my Jesus encounter had a direct impact on my wife, Trisha. But for her, right, it maybe felt more like a second-hand encounter. Now, we're going to learn more about this type of second-hand encounter, what happens, what it looks like in today's passage. And we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 27. Nearly the very end of the book of Acts. So if you want to start turning there. And I suppose before we go any further, I should just come out and say it. I have some bad news for you. And it has to do with the context of the scenarios in which these secondhand Jesus encounters occur, right? Because today's scenario in which this type of encounter occurs is when they're struggling with adversity. When we find ourselves in hardship or affliction or misfortune, that's the context of today's encounter. And I have more bad news for you. I was racking my brain. You know, we've had this series laid out for months, and I was racking my brain as we approached this message, trying to think of examples through Scripture and examples that I've had in my own personal experience of this sort of second-hand encounter with God. And the bad news is that every single encounter I could think of, that I could come across, right, of this type of secondhand Jesus encounter, the one we're going to look at today, they all occurred in the midst of adversity. But we'll learn more a little bit about that. So these concepts of a secondhand encounter and adversity, we'll see a little bit more as we travel through our passage. But now, Acts chapter 27 that we're going to be entering into in a moment, it's quite a long chapter. It's a huge chapter. And we're going to start reading in verse 9, right? We're going to jump right into the middle of this chapter. And that means we'll be joining the Apostle Paul mid-journey. He's on a boat voyage, and he's traveling across the Mediterranean Sea. He's traveling from the coast of Israel all the way to Rome. And this is a huge journey that he's on, that we're joining him in this morning. That's over 1,500 miles by sailboat. So why is Paul making this huge journey this morning? Why is he making this huge boat journey to Rome? Well, Paul has been facing fierce opposition as the book of Acts has progressed. And in the later chapters of the book of Acts, we see that there is a strong anti-Christian movement in Jerusalem. He's already been attacked and nearly killed, right, by a violent mob of anti-Christian protesters. And this anti-Christian movement begins plotting how they can capture Paul. And they're trying to do bad things to him. And even though Paul is innocent, right, it's obvious, even the rulers say, oh, this guy's innocent. The anti-Christian protesters manage to get Paul arrested as the book of Acts unfolds. And Paul sits in prison as a political prisoner for years. It's wild, right? And there's major corruption in this ancient Near Eastern judicial system. Paul is facing bitter injustice and serious adversity. And so Paul basically appeals his case to the Supreme Court, essentially. Right? He appeals to the Supreme Court, but in ancient Near Eastern Rome, what they would do is they would appeal to Caesar. They would appeal to the high court in Rome. And so that means that Paul needs to travel from Jerusalem all the way to Rome to go to essentially the Supreme Court to make his appeal. Hence, that's how we find Paul this morning in this massive 1,500 plus mile boat voyage. And remember, during this time, throughout this journey we're going to be reading about this morning, Paul is technically a political prisoner. He's there with armed Rome guards. He's a prisoner. And he's on this journey to a court in Rome to appeal his case. So basically, from the very start of our passage this morning, we need to realize that Paul is already knee-deep in adversity, in hardship, in misfortune. And now there are 4 parts that we're going to break this morning's passage into, since it's a long passage, right? We're basically going to divide this long chapter 27 into 4 sections, 4 quarters. And each one of those sections, we're going to read the passage, that section, right? Then we're going to unpack that bit of the passage, and then we're just going to connect that bit of the passage to our lives. See how it speaks to our lives. And we'll do that all the way through, just every quarter of this passage. So again, this morning, we've broken this passage 4 parts, and we're going to see how each one of these parts, as we go along, connects to our lives. So let's go ahead and join Paul mid-boat voyage, right? In Acts chapter 27, picking up in verse 9. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also." But the centurion, this Roman centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. Verse 13, then a gentle south wind began to blow. They saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called a northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So they gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of the south island of Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together because they were afraid they would ram aground on the sandbars of Citrus. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that next day that they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Now, in this first section, sometimes it's hard to picture what's going on. So what I've got for you is a picture of a map up on the screen. And basically, this is the Mediterranean Sea. You can see Italy, Rome would be up towards the north. You've got Africa down towards the south. And there's that island of Crete. And they were attempting to kind of go around the island to a better harbor for the winter. Remember, they're mid-journey. They're midway from Jerusalem going to Rome. And they get that southwestern wind, right? That northeaster that's coming and blowing them southwest, and it blows them way off course. They're trying to go north, and it blows them south. And I want you to realize that they find themselves kind of out in the middle where that question mark is. And if you look at the scale of the map, they are hundreds of miles out to sea, out from the coast, the middle of nowhere. Hundreds of miles drifting. That's the area you go to if you want to not come back, right? They are lost at sea. And as we look at this map and we start to think about, the situation they are finding themselves in, this hurricane, it keeps raging and raging day after day. And the boat is being torn to pieces, right? And this is no small boat, by the way. This is a huge, massive boat. There are well over 200 people on this boat, right? Paul gives us the number later in this passage. But this boat, scholars look at and they try to size, and this boat that Paul's on, this ship, right? It's probably over 100 feet in length. It's massive. But this boat is being shredded to bits. And the sailors start to throw all their stuff overboard, right? And when the sailors start throwing things overboard, they're like throwing the goods and the packages they were supposed to deliver overboard. That's a bad sign, right? And then when the sailors start tying loops and start tying rope under the boat and start tying the boat together to keep it from falling apart, that's a really bad sign, right? And then when the sailors start to throw the boat's equipment, when they're throwing the sails to the boat overboard, right? They're throwing the equipment overboard. That is an absolutely dire situation. That is not good to see, right? This is the last resort. Friends, there is nothing more they can do. These are the last things that they can do. They have tried and done everything they can. They are out of options, hopeless. Verse 20, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Lost at sea. So what do you call it when you're lost hundreds of miles offshore, right? In a hurricane with the boat tearing apart. What do we call that? We call that adversity. Adversity, right? A state of hardship, affliction, or misfortune. Adversity. Now, I know that there were as we're reading about this. We're reading about this boat story, this boat journey, right, that Paul's on. But maybe you know the sort of adversity that those sailors are going through, what they're feeling. Maybe you've faced or are facing adversity, a state of hardship, affliction, or misfortune. But remember back to where I said this morning that this is a second-hand Jesus encounter that we're looking at this morning. And I could only locate these kinds of encounters happening in the midst of this terrible context we call adversity. You know, part of the reason why I think these sorts of Jesus encounters, this special kind of Jesus encounter, these second-hand encounters, the reason why they occur in the midst of adversity is because when they were not in adversity, they didn't listen to Paul. Their radar was not up, right? They were exercising other options. They weren't looking for a Jesus encounter to save them. And Paul even warned them. We read about it in this passage, right? Paul warned them, our voyage is going to be a disaster. But no one listened. And for us to really have this kind of secondhand experience that we're going to read about in a moment, we almost have to be driven by adversity to a similar point that these sailors are at, where we're out of options. And I want you to realize that that's finally the moment, right, in the middle of overwhelming adversity, that they are right in the scenario, right in the context where they'll be able to turn and hear Paul, to be able to experience this secondhand Jesus encounter. And we have to keep that in the back of our minds. So let's read more and see this secondhand encounter unfold. What does it look like? What happens exactly? So going on to our second portion of the passage, Acts chapter 27, verses 21 through 26. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your confidence, your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the Lord, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. To keep up your courage, men. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island,'" right? Wow, so Paul is so humbly pointing out for us, right? He's so humbly pointing out for us, I told you so, right? Maybe not so humble, right? I told you this would happen, but no one listened to me, right? But now that we're stricken with adversity, now that we've been pushed to the point of being hopeless, and all our options are void, now is the proper context that they're going to undergo this second-hand Jesus experience. And in this second-hand encounter, God sent a messenger, an angel to Paul. And really that messenger, that angel, repeats a message that Jesus himself told Paul a few chapters earlier in an encounter that Paul had with Jesus. But that message directly impacted everyone that is around Paul. In fact, Paul's God encounter involves them, right? It talked about their fate as well as Paul's fate. Now let's connect what we just read to our own lives and just realize with me that we do this all the time. I do this, right? When we are in the midst of adversity, we all look back. It's this thing, you know when it happens, right? We look back and we say things to ourselves like, why didn't I listen to so-and-so before all this happened, right? Why didn't I listen beforehand? I see it every day with my daughter, Elizabeth, right? I made a pizza for dinner not too long ago, and I told her the pizza was really hot, right? It just come out of the oven, and she said, okay, right? So it's like, wait a minute, like, I'm gonna go get a napkin. Wait a minute, it's really hot. And then 5 seconds later, right, she proceeds to take a bite of the pizza, and it burns her mouth. And she immediately afterwards thought to herself, why didn't I listen? You told me, yeah, right? We go through, but we have that experience in our lives so often. Wow, why didn't I listen? And even in the midst of adversity sometimes, when we're in the middle of that hurricane, and notice that the sailors have tried to fix it themselves, right? They have exhausted every option before they were in the place where they were really able and ready to have this experience. And so often, that's our scenario. That's where we're at. I know it happens to me. It's miserable. I hate it, right? But sometimes God has to send us a hurricane, and it's terrible because then we can't possibly fix it. And it's in that moment where we're out of options, we get to that point where we're actually able and ready to hear and have that experience, to have what those sailors are going to experience. And if you're gritting your teeth saying, I'm not sure I like these secondhand encounters, right? I saved them for the last message. I was trying to spare you, right? No, I'm right there with you because oftentimes these encounters make us face these tough questions like, why didn't I listen beforehand to Paul? Why did I have to take the hard route? Okay. Let's move on to the next portion of the chapter, the next section of the chapter, and see what happens next. Acts chapter 27, verse 27 through 38. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that they would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were lowering some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have had gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. He broke it and gave it to them to eat. They were encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of them on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. So basically, Paul comes out and says, come with me, right? Come with me. This is the moment we're going all in. We're going all in, right? Eat up, this is your last meal, and cut the lifeboat, right? Cut the lifeboat, there's no plan B. And there are 276 people whose lives have just been placed on the line. right? And the adversity is overwhelming, right? And the stakes are high with this whole secondhand encounter Jesus experience thing, right? The stakes are high. I mean, just imagine what it would have been like for those sailors or some of those other people on board watching the lifeboat, the ropes of the lifeboat cut. That's their only other option. Hundreds of miles out to sea, and they watch it float away. It would feel like Paul just took your entire life savings. He took the house, the farm, everything, right? In fact, he took your very life and he went to like the Vegas roulette table, right? And he pushed all the chips in, everything on 25 red, right? And you're like, are you crazy? Like, what? There's no coming back from this if this doesn't work. And I wrestled with the application of what we just read. Because these secondhand kind of experiences that we're seeing in this passage, they usually involve some sort of step of faith. Not always life or death, as literally cutting the lifeboats, right? But a step of faith all the same. One of the examples that comes to mind, think of Moses meeting with God, right? Mount Sinai. And he comes back to the Israelites who are facing adversity. They're slaves, right? And he says, I had this God encounter. Now it's time for your secondhand encounter. Pack up everything. We're going to wander out into the desert where there's no food or water. And God's going to bring us to a land that we've never seen. All in. And I started this message mentioning when I was called into ministry. And Tricia went through that kind of secondhand experience, that secondhand encounter. And the moment for us, right? That experience involved that step of faith for us as well. For her. It involved this step of faith where to follow this call that God had, it involved both of us quitting our stable jobs, right? Our stable, high-paying jobs, and then moving 2,000 miles away and completely starting over with nothing. No house, no job, like nothing, right? And it was that moment, that step of faith. Okay, all in, cut the lifeboats. The step of faith. And it seems like these sorts of experiences, these sorts of encounters, these secondhand experiences with Jesus, they seem to involve adversity and a step of faith. On to our final section of this passage. Our last section of this passage for this morning. Acts chapter 27, verse 27 through 38. I'll read it for you. Sorry, verse 39 through 44. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach, but the ship struck a sandbar and run aground. The bow struck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on the other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. So there's this adversity, right? Then this secondhand encounter that they have with Paul, and finally a huge step of faith. And now, everyone on the boat is saved, right? Hooray! But as God came through on his word right? In the middle of the night, they're cutting the lifeboats. They can't see the shore. They're throwing the food overboard. No second chances. But in the morning, they see the shore. They see the promise being fulfilled. And as hope begins to stir, so often as it happens with us, did you notice how fast everyone tried to stop listening to Paul? All over again. Paul says the boat must run aground, right? The boat's going to be destroyed. But yet the sailors grab hold of the rudder and say, we're aiming for the beach. And Paul says, we all must stay together to survive, right? And the Roman soldiers immediately start worrying about a prisoner escaping, right? And start planning to kill them. And I was pondering this secondhand encounter that we're seeing and how it often involves adversity. And man, just like those people traveling with Paul, that adversity makes them start listening. It makes it so they become part of that Jesus encounter. And I was pondering why it is that secondhand encounters, like the one we saw in this passage, like the ones I've described through this message, why it is that they often involve faith steps. Why is it that they often involve faith steps? A big step of faith. And I think those steps of faith are necessary because they seem to really solidify that this is, in fact, a God encounter. Think of it this way. If I had an encounter with Jesus, right, maybe during the week, and maybe it involved you, maybe it didn't, right? But there was no step of faith, no action on your part, no nothing that you needed to do, right? And I started telling you about it, right? Really what that would be is that would just be me telling you about an encounter. It wouldn't really be a second-hand encounter like the ones we're seeing in this passage. See, what would make it a second-hand encounter is when you get roped into the middle of it. It would be, when Paul encounters with this encounter with Paul, it transforms into something more, right? It was something Paul experiences, but it transforms into something more. And it becomes an encounter that you get to participate in. And that's when it becomes an our encounter, an us encounter. And that only seems to happen if it involves a step of faith. See, what that encounter I had when I got called into ministry involved, after the week after that it happened, I remember Tricia and I were talking. And Tricia would say things like, Michael had this happen to him, right? And it impacts me. But Michael had this thing happen to him. She would describe what happened to me and how it involved God. But when we took that step of faith together, the way she describes the story is different now. When we both had to leave our jobs and move across the country with no idea what was next, right? No land on the horizon. When we both saw God come through for both of us, that's what made it a secondhand encounter. And looking back on it, she would describe it. I've heard her share her testimony. She would say, wow, we encountered God on that journey. We saw God do incredible things. Wait, it wasn't just Michael's thing, right? No, the step of faith is what transformed it into our encounter. And as this message begins to wind down, we've made it through this big section of the passage. Just remember what is involved with this kind of God encounter that we saw showing up in this passage, right? Adversity and a step of faith. Yikes. I'm not sure I want to go looking for this kind of encounter, right, with Jesus. Welp, sometimes he goes looking for you with this kind of encounter, right? And now we're better able to identify it. Now we know what's going on better, right? We know what this type of encounter with God, this weird thing that we've called a secondhand encounter this morning, what it looks like. Now there's one final thought I want to share with you that involves this passage. It has to do with adversity itself. Because when we face hardship and misfortune, our gut reaction, right, in the midst of this kind of Jesus encounter, our gut reaction is to say, why, God? Why? Like, why? Seriously, we had to be starving. We had to be lost in a storm for 14 days. We had to be blown way off course, right? And shipwrecked on a foreign land. Why? Why was this necessary? Why is this the plan? Why would Jesus let all this adversity happen in this way? And I just want you to imagine what it would have been like being on board that ship with Paul. This island, as you continue reading through the book of Acts, I'd encourage you to take a look at it, because this island they get marooned on, right, is the island called Malta. It's not a very big island. It's a fraction of the size of the Hawaiian Islands. And they were blown way off course. It's that little island up there, way off course, way west. There's no way they were looking for this island, right? And the inhabitants of this island that they end up on, they all worshiped a pagan god. But while Paul is stuck on this island for 3 months, ship's wrecked, they're marooned, 3 months he spends on this island, right? God opens some interesting doors and opportunities on this island. And Paul ends up ministering to the inhabitants of the island. He tells them about Jesus. He saves people. He does miracles. And a brand new church is planted on the island of Malta before Paul leaves. And it was amazing, right? God made the most of a bad situation. And he managed to use their shipwreck, their adversity, for good. And oftentimes, we see a little bit of what happens. We see a little bit of what happens with Malta and Paul's shipwreck and this huge adversity that he faces and being starving for 14 days, this whole traumatizing event. We see a little bit of it. The book of Acts ends, and we're left with this impression that God made the most of a bad situation, maybe. He managed to use their adversity somehow for good. But we, like Paul, like in his life, oftentimes we do not see the full effect that adversity we went through, what happens because of it. Being blown off course, shipwrecked and stranded on an island for 3 months, right? And I just want you to realize, before we close, what ended up happening to this island of Malta after Paul left, long after he was dead, right? Nowadays, 2,000 years later, modern time, if you were to go to this island of Malta, right, you could go there. If you were to travel to Malta, I want you to realize that Paul completely changed this island. To this day, if you were to go to Malta, there's different estimates, but it's between 90 to 95% of the population would identify and say, I'm a Christian. I follow Jesus. 90 to 95% of the population to this day. Sometimes there's those moments that we don't see the full impact of what we've done, of being blown offshore, of the adversity we faced. Right now, on Malta, there are over 400,000 people, just right now, 400,000 people that say, I follow Jesus. Because Paul got in a storm. Because his ship fell apart. Because they starved for 14 days. and he got marooned on an island for 3 months. Way off of course. You know, God sometimes has bigger plans for those God moments that we experience, those hardships. Man, these kinds of God encounters are hard. They involve adversity. They involve a step of faith. But sometimes even through those kind of encounters, God has bigger plans involved than even just us. That adversity, he has plans beyond Paul, beyond the sailors, beyond even the end of the book of Acts. Looking back on it, we say, wow, that was amazing that God sent a northeaster and pushed Paul into adversity. That there are literally over 4,000 people standing right now in Malta, on this earth right now, that have been affected by it. Change the course of history. And it gives us hope and a perspective. When we sense that season comes of our own, that we face those Acts 27 style encounters, sometimes they have an impact even greater than what we could have imagined. Let's pray together. Father, we just thank you for this passage. Reading through this passage, I'm reminded of before Paul even has this shipwreck and this encounter. Paul writes to us in 2 Corinthians, and he talks about how he's been multiple shipwrecks. He has experienced so much adversity. And he shares about it and says, man, God didn't waste one moment of it. And sometimes it took adversity for our ears and our eyes to be opened, for us to finally surrender and say, okay, I'll listen. I pray that, man, if we experience that kind of secondhand encounter, that you would just help us to have the faith to say, okay, cut the lifeboats. Okay, we're going all in. Because God, that's how you do incredible things. That's how even 2,000 years later, there's still 400,000 people that have been impacted by a boat that got caught in a storm that required a step of faith. Would you help us to be faithful in those moments as well? We pray. In Jesus' name, amen.